The Korean War ended in a stalemate between the UN-backed South Korean forces and Communist-backed North, as the country remains divided to this day. There are many reasons that the Korean War ended in a stalemate and neither side won the war. So in today's video, I will be talking about some of the reasons it was a stalemate and what could have been changed to produce a South Korean victory, as well as what I think would have happened if the South Koreans won the Korean War. Now, one obvious condition that gave North Korea a major leg up to make the war a stalemate was Chinese intervention. However, I already did a video on what if China did not intervene in the Korean War, so check out that video for that scenario. Now with that shameless self-promotion out of the way, what else can be changed to make South Korea win the war? Using nuclear weapons in the Korean War to defeat the Chinese and North Koreans would have to also be another video, as there are a lot of other conditions to make that happen and a lot of drastic results which would have to come about from nuclear weapons being used. Therefore, I'll save that scenario for another video entirely. So for this video, the UN and South Koreans will win the Korean War militarily in 1953 against the Chinese and North Koreans. How would this happen, you might ask? Well, there are going to have to be a lot of conditions to change in order to create these results to have a military victory by the South Koreans without using nuclear weapons and while also keeping Chinese intervention in the war. Starting with Chinese intervention in the Korean War, Peng Dehuai led the second phase campaign, which was when China entered the war in a massive offensive into North Korea. His strategy was to draw UN forces so far northward that their supply lines were overstretched, and he correctly assessed that the three primary assets was the UN possessing good logistics, air power, and American artillery, and Peng also planned on creating an offensive to deprive the UN of all three. The Chinese troops would also be familiar with the territory, and the UN transportation and supply lifelines would be longer and of course more vulnerable to attacks by guerrillas. Peng reasoned that if the PVA forces could destroy 2 or 3 UN divisions, then the character of the war would change to benefit China and North Korea. In the days leading up to the start of the Chinese second phase offensive, both 8th Army Commander General Walton Walker and U.S. 1st Marine Division General Oliver P. Smith were wary of advancing as rapidly as MacArthur's headquarters in Japan had urged them to do. Both generals had warned their troops of the dangers of advancing so quickly against an enemy that seemed like an inferior force, and in the end they both proved to be correct. After the successful Chinese offensive, the UN was forced out of North Korea, and the last slugfest of the Korean War began to resemble World War I, with little ground gained on each side after the UN liberated Seoul after the Fourth Battle of the City, and this would be the last 2 years of the war. Changes to the offensive that can be made to put the UN and South Korean forces in a better position to win the war by 1953 would be if MacArthur takes the warnings about Chinese interventions more seriously, and therefore the UN advance will have to go a bit slower through North Korea to maintain proper supply lines which will be able to be properly guarded to avoid Chinese and guerrilla attacks to maintain the UN's 3 primary assets. MacArthur will also possibly need to remain in command just because when Truman relieved him, it devastated American public support for the war and divided the American population on whether or not MacArthur should have been relieved of command. A lot of people also might think that MacArthur was nuke-crazed and that if he stayed in command that he would drop the bomb, but that would just not happen. Also, MacArthur's views on the nuclear bomb was on targeting military targets only, as he actually hated the bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki. Although MacArthur remaining in command is not needed as a condition, it's just something that could possibly help. Another condition could be to have General Walton Walker survive his traffic collision. On December 23, 1950, Walker was killed when his northbound command jeep collided with a southbound weapons carrier truck from a South Korean Army division that had swung out of its lane. This is easily avoidable if the truck could just stay in its own lane. Walker was a highly experienced American officer known for his extraordinary heroism in World War I, World War II, and Korea. During the Korean War, Walker commanded troops at the Pusan perimeter, led mostly a defensive war until the Incheon landings, and is credited with single-handedly saving the 8th Army during the second phase offensive. The Communist forces would need to start losing the stalemate, where UN forces began using the momentum from the May to July 1951 offensive. It's possible that MacArthur could launch a similar amphibious attack to the Incheon landing somewhere around this time, but on the eastern side of the Korean peninsula to send shockwaves in the Chinese lines. Or similarly, Walker could better solidify UN lines in early 1951, but to potentially win the Third Battle of Seoul in January, which will heavily impact UN momentum and Chinese offensive capabilities, as there's no need for the UN to re-liberate Seoul if they don't need to retake it again. I'm not going to continue on about more changes because it's time to talk about the effects of having South Korea win the war. North Korea is essentially dissolved, and there are likely communist purges in North Korea before the solid reunification of the Korean peninsula. Korea becomes a strong U.S. ally as the state is on the border with a very humiliated and angry China. The new DMZ is along the Chinese and North Korean border, where the northmost miles of North Korea is the new demilitarized zone. The Chinese and United States do not open up negotiations or relations possibly until Reagan's presidency in the 1980s due to the Chinese Communist Party and U.S. relations tanking even further following the Korean War and the communist defeat. Perhaps the Sino-Soviet split opens the door for Nixon to make the first steps to opening China, but I feel like this defeat causes China to stay mad until Reagan comes around. Eisenhower has an even higher approval ratings for ending the Korean War in a victory. The 1950s Cold War will see America heavily support Korea to deter a potential Chinese attack into the country, but there's another region that is going to be heavily impacted by a U.S. victory in Korea, and that is Indochina. It's possible that perhaps later on in the 1960s, the U.S. might drive more for the Vietnam War due to winning in Korea and fall into the same Vietnam War that we saw in our timeline. Or it's completely possible that the American public will be stronger on pro-Vietnam War to push America to do even more against the Viet Cong and North Vietnamese. However, that's just completely unknown. Or this alternate U.S. could desire to avoid the Vietnam War, as in our timeline, the Never Again Club was formed by Matthew Ridgway, who was MacArthur's successor, and in it, nobody wanted another Korean War after the stalemate. It's considered the war to be a complete debacle. And it's possible that many U.S. generals would look at the Korean War that, although it was a success, they would point to it and say, hey, let's not do this in Vietnam. But again, it's impossible to determine this. Anyway, assuming the Vietnam War still goes as it does, then the Chinese would increase their support for North Vietnam, as China is not wanting to repeat the alternate Korean War that has already happened and have another communist country on their border fall and be replaced by a thriving U.S.-backed country. Additionally, one other reason why the U.S. might not want to intervene in the Vietnam War is to not increase another war with China and have relations with them further severed. And also, America is already having to put a lot of stuff into the alternate Korean peninsula, and the U.S. may not want to divert a lot of resources to Vietnam. But that is, of course, just one possible scenario for if South Korea won the Korean War. What do you think would have happened? Write in the comments, and thank you for watching.